Hi everybody. Let's begin with a couple of announcements. First of all, remember that what you ought to do is get a 3-ring binder that you can put the printed notes and the in-class exercises in. So if you haven't already done that, please take the time over the weekend to get a copy of the notes printed out and the in-class exercises and put it into that 3-ring binder. The introductory assignment is due today, assuming you're watching this on Friday, the 27th of August. Homework 0 is due on Friday by 5 p.m. and that's the bonus points where I don't normally have any kind of bonus points available, so completing that assignment is definitely worth your time. The next assignment in the queue after that one is homework number 1, which is some questions having to do with this section on interest. That assignment will be due at 11 o'clock on Wednesday, September 1st. So if you have some questions or have run into roadblocks along the way on that assignment, I will have my usual in-person office hours before that assignment is due. So you can feel free to see me in person or give me a call on Teams. And of course, I'm happy to receive your questions and do my best to answer them via email as well. When you submit your work, remember that you're going to be uploading the assignment to Blackboard. And so your handwriting should be neat and clear. The PDF file you generate should be black and white to help improve the contrast. And I'd ask you to write your assignment out on either a blank piece of paper or on engineering computation paper. Don't use lined notebook paper because especially when it comes to drawing out cash flow diagrams, that'll just make it more difficult for the grader to follow your work. In today's class, I'm going to show you how to create cash flow diagrams, and we're going to be talking about the way that we keep track of inflows and outflows over the course of the semester and set a few standards that will continue to follow throughout the entirety of the problems that we work on. As with before, the majority of this class recording comes from the previous semester, so you may notice me making some incidental references to dates or times that don't quite match up with what you might expect, but that's okay. That's not the important thing. The material is the same between both semesters, and so without any further ado, if you have any questions, reach out and let me know, but let's get into the lecture having to do with cash flows. But first, interest. Just sometimes it becomes tempting in this class just to think that it's all about the formulas and the equations, because there certainly will be a lot of that. But it's also important for you to understand the underlying ideas, because it's those concepts that are going to be more durable, and you're going to retain the ideas probably for a longer period of time than you're going to retain an ability to plug and chug through the formulas that you get used to in this equation. So I do want you to know the concepts. And so let's talk about interest. And a borrower who's taking out a loan has to pay the lender interest to compensate them for what? In other words, I'm asking here, why is it that interest gets charged? What are some of the factors that makes it so that borrowers have to pay interest? So if you know the answer, go ahead and unmute your microphone and tell me, why is it that we charge interest for loans?
Because of risk, maybe more than it is later.
Okay. 3 people answered all at the same time, and all of the answers were there that are applicable. So good job. I don't mind it if you accidentally talk over each other. That's unavoidable, but you're absolutely right. 2 people said risk. Somebody, I think, said because of the time value of money. So let's briefly go through what all of that means. So first of all, there's the time value of money aspect of it. And what that means is that money now is more valuable than money in the future because of the inflation. And what I mean by inflation is it's price inflation. That is, things in the future are going to cost more than they do now, and so therefore the money now is more valuable than it is then because you're going to need more dollars in the future to buy those things. Or to put it another way, things cost less now than they will in the future, therefore $1 now can buy more things than it will in the future. So when you take out a loan and you're taking valuable dollars now and you're repaying it with less valuable dollars in the future, you have to compensate the lender for that loss of value. So that's one aspect of it. That's part of the reason why you have to pay interest. And then risk is another component of it. Does anybody remember two different types of risk that we've talked about so far? Or just mention one of the specific risk types.
Default risk.
Okay, good. Default risk. Now, default risk is the risk that the person you're loaning the money to may not be able to pay it back. You know, maybe their revenue isn't enough, or they lose the orders that they had, or they've just taken on a loan that's too large and the payments, they can't keep up with them. So that's the default risk. And the other risk is interest rate risk. Interest rate risk is a little bit more complicated to understand, but basically the idea is, think about what if you gave somebody a loan and then suddenly because of what's going on in the economy, interest rates go up, and now you're stuck getting a little bit of interest from someone when you could have taken that money and loaned it out at the higher interest rate. So you've lost the chance to earn a greater rate of return. So there's that risk that, you know, over a longer duration, there's a greater probability that interest rates are going to go up and any one of your investments is going to be relatively less attractive because it's at now a lower interest rate. So these are some of the factors I wanted to reiterate and bring back into your mind. All right, let's talk about cash flows. And I think I've rearranged some of the slides today compared to what you may find it in your printed notes. And that's unavoidable. I'm always tinkering around with the slides, so hopefully that doesn't throw people off too much. Just skip ahead a couple of slides and point with arrows and so on. But inflows are revenues. It's the money that you get. Other words for it may mean receipts or incomes. Another idea that's at first a little bit counterintuitive is if a project that you do saves money, let's say that you put insulation in a warehouse, and now you don't have to use as much electricity to heat the warehouse, then the savings compared to your previous costs is considered an inflow. Even though you're not getting any actual new money, it just means that your expenses are lower than they used to be. That still counts as an inflow if you do something to reduce your expenses. All right, so all of those things we consider as an inflow, and we use the positive sign when we're doing calculations having to do with the inflow and the outflow of cash. Outflows are sometimes called disbursements, costs, expenses. The taxes that are incurred by projects are considered as outflows, and we use the minus sign when we're doing formulas with those. And so net cash flow is when you have the inflow minus the outflow. So you can think of it as profit. Revenue minus disbursements. So revenue minus costs is profit. And another word for that is your net cash flow. Now, when we are setting things up graphically, when we're trying to represent when you get money on a timeline, what we typically assume is that your costs and your revenues come all at once at the end of a period. So for example, if we are doing a cash flow diagram that goes week by week, we assume that you receive all of your revenue and you pay all your expenses at the end of the week. Or if it's monthly, you assume that you get all of your transactions post, so to speak, at the end of the period. So that's the default assumption in Excel as well. When we start to learn certain pre-existing formulas that are built into Excel, the default assumption is the end of period assumption. We can override that in the formulas and tell it to assume that the revenue comes at the beginning of the period. But by far the more common approach also in the real world is that you get paid after doing the work. Okay, so why would we want to graphically represent the flow of money? Just as an illustration, here is a cash flow statement. This is English explaining what happens in a certain circumstance. You borrow $10,000, excuse me, at 6% interest compounded annually. to be paid back after 5 years. How much must be repaid? So, I mean, you can understand that. If you think about it for a second, all the data that you need to understand the scenario is right there in front of you in text form. But, I mean, there's a lot of squiggles there. If you just look at, like, what is language? What are letters? You know, letters are shapes that mean certain things. And translating the ideas into shapes and vice versa, this is more shapes than this. And so if you wanted to represent in a graphical format this same idea, what you could do is you could draw a horizontal line, and you can notice that we have tick marks that represent each year. And what we're going to say is anything above the line is going to represent money that you get, and anything below the line is money that you pay. And so we can represent this English language statement, which is just a series of scribbles that the shapes mean sounds and the sounds mean ideas and so on. It's an arrow that's up at time 0, meaning that you get $10,000 now. Time 0 means the present. And then after 5 years, there's a line down, which means you have to pay. And we don't know the amount, and graphically how we represent that is you can see that there are question marks next to the F label. F means a future amount. So that's one way to say that we don't know the amount compared to the $10,000 that was at the present. You know, that's a numerical amount. And then the other way that we illustrate that that's an unknown amount is with the dashed line. And so a dashed line kind of just means we don't know exactly how big it is, and we don't have to draw these cash flow diagrams exactly to scale. I mean, we don't have to be counting pixels to make sure that the length of the arrow exactly represents how many dollars there is. But, you know, it's nice if it's roughly, you know, a small amount of money is a small arrow, a larger amount of money is a relatively larger arrow, and so on. So I think you can see that graphically representing this situation, just at a glance, within seconds, you can instantly understand that what this scenario is find out how much is the amount in year 5, 6% interest. Whereas you just simply can't understand the scenario as quickly if you're reading it in English. So there's different ways for us to pose problems like this, and I'm going to give you practice in the assignment of translating the English statement into a cash flow diagram and vice versa. All right. So are there any questions about this cash flow diagram? Why things are this way? Any questions? All right. So the symbols, by the way, this had labels like I and P and F. Let's talk about that a little bit more. I means interest rate, and it's assumed that the interest rate is interest rate per period. And so in the problem statement, it will tell you what the periods are. For example, 5 years, and it says compounded annually. And so then you know that each one of the tick marks on your cash flow diagram is going to represent a year. There are going to be other times in the future where interest is compounded on a monthly basis. And so if we had interest that was compounding monthly over a 5-year period, that would mean that you need 60 tick marks, because it would be 5 times 12, which is 60. Okay, so n, the number of periods, you have to read the statement and understand through the compounding frequency how many periods there are going to be in the time frame that you're representing. P means a lump sum at the present. Present is time 0. And then F is a lump sum in the future. So these are variables that we're going to use all through the semester. So another way to simplify this English language description of what's happening is just by assigning values to the variables. For P equals 10,000, I equals 6% per year, N equals 5, what is F? And there are tables in your textbook, in the appendix at the back of the book, where you can look up in the 6% table a factor that you'll be able to use to calculate F really easily. Joshua, do you have a question? All right, I thought I saw Joshua.
No.
Joshua, do you have a question?
No, I don't have one.
Okay. Now, these cash flow diagrams can be point estimates, which means we assume that the amount is a fixed, specific amount. And so, for example, what this summary is saying is that you get $150,000 a year every year for 6 years. So the A that's here means an annual series. Sometimes they're also called a uniform series or a uniform annual series. And it's called uniform because the amounts are the same. And so if it says A and you can see that the arrows are approximately the same length, you can take that as a clue that the amount is going to be the same repeating amount every year. That's a point estimate. Now, we can also have range estimates. And sometimes you don't know, if you're projecting into the future, exactly how much revenue you might make. You know, if you're buying a food truck and you're hoping to sell a lot of grilled cheese sandwiches, but you don't know exactly how much, then maybe what you do is you'd run the numbers and perform an analysis over a range of values. And so you could say maybe your revenue is going to be anywhere between $135,000 and $150,000. And so you can see what I've done is I've put these dashed lines at the minima and the dashed lines at the maxima of our estimates. And so then you could find out whether purchasing a certain investment opportunity is justified based on the low value, based on the high value. These range estimates are used to illustrate uncertainty. All right. Let's do that raising the hand thing. How many of you have printed out the InClass exercises for semester? Please raise your hand if you've already printed out all of those. I think it's 60 plus pages. All right, most people have done that already. I'm glad to see that. Maybe a lot of people haven't though. Thank you. It'll be a lot easier for you to follow along if you've got the InClass exercise printed. So what we're going to start with is these first two questions. I guess you don't need to have the whole semester printed as long as you've got today's. Every day I'm just going to be interested on if you've got today's printed. So today, InClass Exercise 3, I'm going to pause for a moment and ask you to draw a couple of cash flow diagrams. I won't put you into the breakout rooms quite yet. This is kind of an individual thing, drawing the sketch on your paper. I'll pause, stop talking, give you a chance to draw cash flow diagram sketches on 1 and 2, and then we'll take a look at this together. Somebody asks about having it open on a separate screen. Sometimes that'll be okay, but other times it'll be better if you can write on the page itself, you know, because you'll be sketching on top of a cash flow diagram. So that won't be as good as having it on paper in those cases. All right, so I'm going to pause for a second and give you a chance to solve 1 and 2. Head start on what these cash flow diagrams look like. I've not got the right one opened up. It'll just take me a moment though. Here we go. All right, so cash flow diagram number 1 here. Draw a sketch. You receive $10,000 from the bank, and then starting 1 year from today, you make 4 annual payments to the bank in the amount of $3,300. Is that the same as what I've written there? Yeah, $3,300. Okay, so the arrow up means that you get the $10,000 now, and then you have to make 1, 2, 3, 4 payments of $3,300. And so it hasn't told us any interest rate there. We could calculate I. There are formulas that relate a lump sum P to a uniform amount A. We could calculate that. But this is the cash flow representation of it. So any questions about this first one? Money that you get is up, money that you pay is down. All right, question 2. You save $10,000 at the end of each year for 6 years, and then at the end of the 7th year you withdraw the balance. The amount is not yet known. And then you have to draw the cash flow diagram from 2 different perspectives, from your perspective and from the bank's perspective. And it says here to include the labels. And so what that means is don't just write the amount, but you also have to have P, A, and F as applicable. Okay, so let's start with what is our perspective if we are going to save the money. And save has 2 meanings, right? It means making deposits to an account, which is an outflow for you. And then save could also mean that it's an expense you no longer have to pay that you used to pay. Remember, I was talking earlier about that kind of, if your heating costs go down because you insulate the warehouse. This save, the save that it says here, is you're depositing money into a bank. And so that's an outflow from your perspective. So let's take a look at what this cash flow diagram should look like from your perspective. You make 6 equal payments of $10,000. And then at the end of the 7th year, you withdraw the balance. The amount is not yet known. So F equals unknown. So the withdrawal is when you're getting your money back. So that's an inflow to you. And sometimes when it talks about like at the end of the 7th year, keeping track of what year it is can be a little bit tricky because time 0 is here, the present. The first year is between 0 and 1, so it's a period. The first year is this segment from 0 to 1, and so the end of the first year is at the number 1. So this tick mark is the end of the first year and the beginning of the 2nd year, because period 2 goes from 1 to 2. So here's the beginning of the 2nd year, the end of the 2nd year. So sometimes it can be a little bit tricky because one point of time is both the beginning of one period and the end of the previous period. All right, so any questions about this first diagram where we're taking a look at what is the cash flow situation from our perspective? Okay, so from the bank's perspective, what's happening to them? Well, they get $3,300 every year for 6 years, and then they have to pay out a lump sum. So it's going to look like the mirror image of from our perspective. The bank's perspective is they have 6 inflows, each of which is $10,000. Then they pay out a lump sum at the end of the 7th year, amount unknown. Okay, so that was questions 1 and 2. Let's take a look at what we've got for the rest of this. Now, translating back and forth between diagrams, tables, and English statements is what we're practicing at in this in-class exercise. Question 3 is I'm asking you to fill in this cash flow table using the diagram. It may seem a little bit pretty simple, and it is, but when we start using Excel, translating a cash flow diagram into an Excel spreadsheet is important. And most of the time when there's a mistake, it's just that we accidentally typed in the number wrong. So you need to get practice being precise in translating a statement to a diagram and a diagram to a table. So here's that practice. Problem 3, fill in this table, the inflows, the outflows, and the net cash flow amount for each year. And then question 4, asking you to draw a cash flow diagram from the bank's perspective with labels. So more practice with that. And then finally, question 5 is one of those stretch questions where we haven't yet talked exactly about how to do problems like this, but I'm going to see if you can go a little bit beyond what I've already told you. Apply your ingenuity, apply your creativity, stretch your mental muscles a little bit, and see if you can use this formula to find out what is the amount of the lump sum for the cash flow diagram that's illustrated. And let me show you how to translate this first cash flow diagram into a cash flow table. So you can see in the present, there's nothing. And so I should have written zeros. There's 0 inflow, 0 outflow, and 0 net cash flow. But each one of these rows just represents a single individual year and what's happening in that individual year. In the future, we're going to do some problems where there will be another column that's called cumulative net cash flow. And when we have that cumulative column, then you will be like combining over time the ins and the outs. But for this table, we don't have to. You'll notice, for example, in year 1, it's 2,000 because there's an in but no outflow. And then in year 2 is the same thing because there's that arrow that's up for 2,000. So it's just an inflow with no outflow. And the net cash flow is also 2,000. So the 2,000 that we experience during year 2 is completely independent of what was before and after it. So this isn't a cumulative column. This is just looking at the specific year in question. So each row is its own year. In the third year, we have an inflow and an outflow. So it's 2,000 in, 1,500 out. So the net cash flow in the third year is 500, and so on and so forth. The problem statement tells us it's 8.5% interest, but having that information doesn't go into our cash flow table. There's going to be lots of times this semester where I give you extraneous information that you don't need to solve the problem. And you may ask why I would do something like that. It's to get you ready for reality, because when you graduate, you're going to have clients and maybe other engineers that you're working with, and there's just always going to be more information than is relevant. People who don't know much about engineering will be telling you all sorts of additional information that really doesn't apply, and you have to practice sorting out the important information from everything that people tell you. So I'll give you a little bit of practice related to that this semester. So the first taste is that you don't need the interest rate to calculate the net cash flow in this cash flow diagram table. So any questions on the first one, on this problem 3? All right, well, what about problem 4, where you receive 25,000? That sounds pretty good. And then in 3 years, you will pay back 30,000. I got a good question as I was among the group. Somebody said, well, does that mean each year? So let's think. If it was going to be each year you had to pay back 30,000, what it would have said is, and in each of 3 years. Or you will have 3 payments, each of them 30,000. So it doesn't say any of those things. And sometimes you have to just apply a little bit of, not I guess work necessarily, but you have to just apply the experience that you've accumulated of reading other problem types. And so you'll get acquainted with what language would be there if this was a periodic payment. So this is a lump sum amount. It's a single $30,000 in 3 years. And so let's look at how that's represented. Okay, there it is. Today you get 25,000. Then in 3 years you pay back 30,000, and then here's the kicker, from the bank's perspective. So that means it's going to be the reverse of what's happening to you. So from the bank's perspective, they pay out 25,000 now at the present, and then they get 30,000 in 3 years, and that's a future amount. So be careful. I mean, you've heard of trick questions. On an exam, you could maybe consider it a trick question if I tell you all this information and at the very end I say, from the bank's perspective. Then that means, the diagram needs to be flipped because we want to know what's happening from a different point of view. Any questions about problem 4?
Can we also split it up in like 3 payments of 10,000 each for an A of 10,000, or
No.
keep it as the F equals 30,000?
It has to be F is 30,000.
Okay.
If you had written A equals 10,000, that's not the same.
Okay.
Yep. That's, the time value money of that is different. So $30,000 at the end of 3 years, it's easier to make that payment than 10,000 per year. And what I mean by easier is overall it's less money, because that's $30,000 in the future is less valuable than some of those dollars being earlier in time. So, I mean, it's not economically equivalent to have $10,000 per year for 3 years. So that's for one thing, is it's not economically equivalent. But then the other thing of it is here, and you'll get a lot more experience with learning how to interpret these problem statements. This language really does mean it's a lump sum in 3 years. Now, it could have been made even more plain. I could have said, and at the end of 3 years, you will pay the bank a lump sum of $30,000. And so, I could have made it even more explicit, but it's not always going to be maximally explicit. They're sometimes going to require a little bit of your experience that you'll accumulate to understand what it's saying. You'll get there. So don't feel uneasy if you don't exactly feel comfortable with it yet. You will. All right, now what about this fifth one, where I didn't even tell you what's going on here? I just threw a formula at you, and I said calculate F. Okay, so let's take a look at what we know. I is 6%. We've got a lump sum amount of 10,000 at time 0, and a lump sum of 5,000 at time 1. All right, so let me ask you, would it be okay for me just to say, to combine these two amounts together, 10,000 plus 5,000 equals 15,000? Should I just say that P is 15,000?
No.
No.
No. Everybody's saying no. Don't do it. Yes, I shouldn't do it because those amounts are in different years, and you can't combine amounts together that are in different years. You have to apply the time value of money, and there's not just a single way to solve this problem. There's a couple of different ways you could get the answer. But anybody willing to describe like what approach you took? Like not specifically like what's the answer you got. Don't tell me your answer, but think in terms of like your pseudocode or your strategy. Like, what was your approach to find F?
What I did was I set up the equation and put 10,000 for P, and then I took my F from that and added it to 5,000 and used that as P the second time, and changing the years. So in the first equation, 1, and the second I had 4.
Okay. So are you saying you moved the $10,000 from time 0 and then you moved it 1 year forward in time and you found the equivalent amount?
Yes.
Okay, that is one of the approaches. And so just to summarize, what he's saying is you find out 10,000 now is going to be worth 10,600 after 1 year, because that 6% interest means you're going to have an extra 600. And so you move the 10,000 forward 1 year in time, and then you move the combined amount to year 5. Since we're out of time, let me just show you the answer of a different approach. And so here's another way of doing it. Move the 10,000 5 years into the future. So you can see I'm using n equals 5 for the 10,000. And then I'm moving the 5,000 4 years forward in time. And then I combine those two amounts that have now been moved forward in time to year 5. And so the future value is $19,694.64.